Tracy for that Siri, wonderful rendition of Corpus Christi. Carol. It didn't really occur to me when I arranged to have my show at TUC that there would be a special significance to the fact that this is a church. For years now, I felt that there is a spiritual aspect to my photography, but for a long time I was cautious about using the word spiritual in describing my work, thinking it perhaps too vague or lofty a term. Now I've come to fully embrace it and to understand more deeply what it means to me. I think of spirituality as a mystical quality that draws us towards the unknown, gives us inspiration, and perhaps motivates us towards pursuing a dream or a vision. Here on the ground, what we see is so much of what we as humans want others to see, how our lawns and homes and buildings appear. But from the sky, this presentation of reality is stripped away, and we see what the land really looks like. We see traces of the landscape aesthetic, but we also see the detritus and decay, the scars and the remnants of humans' efforts from the past. In this lack of orderly, formalized presentation, we can see as much that defies explanation as that which can be explained. It is that which draws me in as I fly my small airplane over the landscape with my camera in hand. It would be much easier to photograph farms and fields and make simple yet visually pleasing images without subjecting myself to much hardship or danger in obtaining them. But that's never been what really compels me. I've been drawn to fly farther, to seek out the unusual landforms, to look more deeply into them, to attempt to make sense of what I'm seeing below me, and to challenge myself to create the most compelling images that I can. There is an innate spirituality in the lands that I photograph. In the coal regions, thousands of miners have died, and many more toiled in untold hardship over the hundreds of years that these lands have been exploited. The remains of some of those lost in mine collapses may well lie beneath the surface of the lands shown in some of these images. As I fly above these areas, I'm fully aware of the present, yet moved by the reflection of history of the sacred ground beneath me. And in that ground, I see images of beauty, such as one might see flowers around the grave site of a loved one. Aerial photography became more of a spiritual endeavor for me in 2009. For decades, I had struggled with depression and alcoholism, which by then had pushed me to the breaking point. My life was truly out of control, and I didn't feel as if I had long to live, despite the fact that I had so much going for me. In June of that year, I finally admitted that I was powerless over my addictions and began a long road to recovery. The early part of recovery brought the most intense fear and insomnia, and the profound realization of the seriousness of the situation that I'd gotten myself into, especially with regards to money. I'd spent all of my earnings and accrued a mountain of debt, but by then I knew that I had begun something with my aerial photography that I needed to continue. I felt as if there were work to be done, and I set my intention to continue to fulfill that mission. In the fall of 2009, I resumed my photography missions to explore the Pennsylvania coal regions. In these missions, I felt a deep seriousness. Often, after paying off my monthly debts, I might just have enough left for food, fuel, and perhaps a room for the night near the airport, where I was close to where I was doing my work. I realized that I had little to offer should I face a major airplane repair away from home, or if I should need to have my aircraft shipped home in the event of a bad landing, which rendered the aircraft unflyable. But I was driven by an almost obsessive passion to create more aerial photography. In recovery, it's often said that if we just don't pick up that drink, then everything will be okay. And so it became with my flying. But I knew that I was going to have to make some changes. One would be dedicating myself to maintaining and flying my airplane to the very best of my ability. In the past, I'd returned home from long flights over hostile terrain to find loose wires barely hanging onto the terminals in my instrument panel, which could have caused a fire or engine failure. So this would no longer be acceptable. During that time, a friend lent me a book entitled Round the Bend by Neville Shute. In the story, a character named Shacklin, who travels around the Middle and Far East in the 1950s, immersing himself in local religious beliefs and practicing aircraft maintenance for the growing regional aircraft carriers, becomes both a spiritual and mechanical guru to the other local aircraft maintenance workers. He says in a speech to a group of workers that, in effect, even if the pilot or your co-workers don't know that you skipped a step in a repair or didn't bother to check something on the aircraft, that God knows. In recovery, many of us are to turn our will and our lives over to our higher power. For some of us, that entity is difficult to define, but I came to believe that it was my higher power's will for me to continue to express myself through my aerial photography. And despite the difficulties that I had experienced, I was able to continue to pursue this dream. So it became very important to honor my higher power by dedicating myself to this higher standard of flying and maintaining my aircraft. The fall of 2009 through fall of 2010 was a very productive and creative time in my photography. But in October of 2010, I encountered and captured a single image that would not only propel my work forward in the world of photography, but also strengthen the essence of spirituality that it conveyed. Flying west over the Manahawkin Bay marshlands, northwest of Atlantic City, New Jersey, I noticed a human-like figure emanating from the marsh below. I quickly made 3 photographs of the figure in the marshes. Later that evening, as I was lying on an air mattress in my friend's house, I was scrolling through the day's images in the back of my camera. I came across this image of the figure in the marsh, and I knew that I had something extraordinary, an image so vibrant, compelling, and full of energy. Here was this wild, primitive, almost electric figure running or dancing through the golden marsh, laced with straight and diagonal lines from drainage channels, appearing like a hieroglyphic painting on a cave wall. For me, this image captured the spirit of perseverance, a seemingly unstoppable energy driving me to take my flying and photography to new heights. It was as if I saw my own spirit dancing in the marshes below. The image became very popular with all those that I showed it to, and would soon get me into group shows at the Center for Fine Art Photography in Fort Collins, Colorado, and the Smithsonian Institution. Many people provided unique interpretations of what they saw in the marsh spirit figure. Some said it reminded them of the Native American spirit figure Cocopelli, while others said that it reminded them of the figure seen in the Nazca lines in Peru. Part of the magic of showing my aerial photographs is hearing each viewer's interpretation of what he or she is seeing in the photograph. But what seemed clear is that this image sparked something very intense in nearly everyone. The opportunity to show my work in Colorado led to further profound spiritual experiences. Visiting with my dear friend Debbie for the reception of the show in Fort Collins, we ventured into the Red Feather Lakes area and visited the Shambhala Mountain Center and the Great Stupa of Dharmakaya. Here we meditated and wandered the rocky hills surrounding the center, searching for a small shrine holding some of the ashes of Allen Ginsberg. We never found the shrine, but the appearance of a pinyon jay seemed to be a message from nature telling us that we were close enough to feel the spirits of this sacred place. While we were there, I decided to take a 1-hour flight in a light airplane with an instructor from a small airport near Denver, flying north to where we had traveled in the previous days. I was so inspired by the landscapes of the front range of the Rocky Mountains as seen from the air that I returned in October and spent a week photographing, both on land and from air, a very special and remote area in northern Colorado called the Red Mountain Open Space. This very ancient place of red shale canyons and buttes was home to the Clovis people, some of the earliest inhabitants of this land. Hiking alone in the early fall snow brought to me a sense of timelessness and wonder. A very important factor that kept me going at times when I had doubt about the direction of my work was that my sobriety had earned me the trust and support of people in my life. In 2011, taking off in my airplane on a hot summer day with a pilot friend, I encountered a problem with air density and engine performance. The airplane stalled or lost lift, and it was all I could do to keep the plane as level as possible before we impacted the cornfield. My friend and I were unharmed, but the airplane was a total loss. Without insurance, over $20,000 in investment and hundreds of hours of work put into the airplane were lost in an instant. Again, I was left seriously questioning how I could continue to pursue my aerial photography. It was suggested that I simply fly with other pilots in order to do my work, but there were several reasons why this really wouldn't work. One was that it would be very costly and unrealistic to hire or ask another pilot to fly me around for hours and hours as I do, contemplating the landscape, spending as much time as I need to circling over a subject to get just the right composition, and even camping overnight or staying in motels near airports in order to get the best light in late afternoon or early morning. But more importantly, my photography is something that comes to me when I'm flying alone, because when I'm flying alone with just my airplane, my camera, and the landscape, that's when I'm truly in my artistic element. Flying the airplane and photographing are an integrated process in the making of my art. In 2009, I had given a presentation on aerial photography to a local flying club at the home of Bruce and Valerie, a couple who had been deeply immersed in aviation for many years, and had funded and supported the expedition by an African-American pilot who flew an open cockpit Boeing Stearman biplane twice to the North Pole, one flight which was featured on the National Geographic Channel. After my presentation, they expressed an interest in acquiring some of my photographs. We formed a close friendship, and they became very supportive of my work. When I lost my airplane in 2011, they offered to lend me the funds to replace it so that I could continue my work. I was deeply honored. I found the same make and model as my previous airplane in very good condition, but with a more powerful engine to prevent the kind of problem I had experienced before. And soon I had a way to continue my photography. But tragically, a week after I flew my airplane home to my home airport in Stewartstown, Bruce died suddenly of cardiac arrest. In the arms of his wife Valerie, she tried to revive him. Bruce had suffered a brain injury in a fall 10 years earlier, and as a couple they worked tirelessly to restore his faculties. He had the most incredible youthful fascination for almost anything historical related to aviation. Their house was like a museum of aviation, and he could recite in the most infinite detail the history and significance of an object. And their stories of flying around the country in their Beechcraft D-18 were endlessly entertaining. Shortly after I bought my new Rans S12, which I named Abeja, meaning bumblebee in Spanish, after her black and yellow paint scheme, I decided that I would always honor the memory of Bruce in my flying and my photography. It was said at his funeral that he just flew west into the sunset and that his spirit is still flying. And when I'm flying now, it's as if I'm sharing the skies with Bruce. In October of last year, a very dear friend lost his struggle with cancer and died at age 52. Lee Fritz was a light sport pilot and a fisherman, and he did both with a gusto that I've rarely seen in anyone. He barely slept and maintained a breathtaking schedule of activities, none of the less of them, which always seemed to include helping others. When Bruce died, Valerie held a memorial for him at their airport home in Howard County. Valerie wished to have some of Bruce's ashes dropped from the air above the field. On the day of the memorial, there also was a G8 summit at Camp David, at the airspace around Washington. called the SFRA, would be especially tightly controlled on that day. The equipment on my plane for flying into that area wasn't working, so I wouldn't be able to fulfill Valerie's wishes. But prior to the ceremony, out of the blue, like an angel, Lee appeared in his little white airplane and landed on the grassy runway. Soon he lifted off again with Valerie and a flask of Bruce's ashes. He made several passes over the field as she released the ashes into the air. This act of kindness and unhindered spirit so impressed me I began to think of Lee as something as a living saint. This was one of so many ways in which he touched others with the goodness of his heart. In his last year, he never let on that he was dying of cancer. We all knew, yet it was never discussed. As his body withered away to just a whisper of what it had been, he continued to fly with others towards the end and fish and bring untold joy to the many who knew and loved him for the wonderful person that he was. In 2012, I made what I called my Marsh Spirits flight. Inspired by my photograph of that name, I began to study maps and satellite imagery of the marshlands of the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay In October, I would make an incredible 3-day flight to photograph much of the lower eastern shore marshlands and the forests that line the marshes. Much of the flying was absolutely sublime, with cool, still air and lovely fall light illuminating the scenery. Unlike my previous photography flights where I might return with 1 or 2 really special images, from this flight the images seemed to work well when shown as a series. I started studying the early history of the Eastern Shore and found that the early inhabitants of that area were called the Nantego people. Nantego being the autonym for the Nanticoke people. I named the series Nantego, and this series was shown in a group show at Salisbury University called This Land. Wanting to learn more about the history and culture of the Eastern Shore, where I was beginning to spend more time visiting and fishing and boating in the marshes, I read James Michener's Chesapeake, which very much inspired my own journey of discovery. In the beginning of the novel, Pentecost, a Susquehannock Indian who lived among a tribe not far from where my little airport is located, where I keep my airplane, is forced to flee his people for fear of persecution for not wanting to participate in the wars against neighboring tribes which are meant to appease the river spirits. He steals a canoe and paddles down the Susquehanna River and over the treacherous Conowingo Rapids, eventually reaching the Chesapeake Bay. After days of paddling, he eventually finds himself on a small island in what is now the Choptank River and discovers a band of native people who refuse to fight wars with their neighbors. He becomes their leader and remains so until the days when the first English settlers arrive in the Chesapeake Bay and soon bring with them the destruction of both the natural environment and the culture of the natives who lived for centuries in harmony with the ecology of the Eastern Shore. As I read this, I developed a sadness and a longing to experience the pristine natural state of the Chesapeake Bay as it was when Pentecost first laid his eyes upon it. I began to see my own journey in its similarity to his. But in my journey, I could only look down and out over the marshes and forests and imagine what they looked like those many, many years ago. In January of this year, our flying community in southeast Pennsylvania lost one of its most cherished members at age 91. Mr. Warren Wetzler flew his 1947 Piper Cub from his home airfield right up through the last year of his life, often arriving at the field in his pajamas and slippers in the early morning to take a serene flight in the still morning air. He had been a college and high school math teacher who also mentored young and old alike in mathematics and was beloved as a member of his local Christian church. Before he died, he passed along his Piper Cub to his grandson, who earned his pilot's license and carries on the tradition of his grandfather today. 2 years ago, I was flying my airplane just east of Hanover, Pennsylvania, when I looked down and saw what appeared to be a clearly defined holy cross made of corn planted in the field. I was surprised and taken in by the figure and circled it several times, making photographs. I filed my photographs away when I returned home and didn't think much about it until recently, when I saw that there was this lovely and very symbolic spiritual symbol represented in the shape of a cross in the field. I decided that I would make a card with the image to give to the grandson at the memorial service for Mr. Warren, as we called him. Driving to the service on a snowy day in January, my friend commented that the image reminded her of a representation of an Easter cross, or the cross of resurrection. Now, I do not consider myself affiliated with any particular religion, but I do respect and sometimes honor the beliefs that people may hold in regards to their religion. Here I began to see this holy cross as a tribute or a memorial to those who have departed the earth. I soon posted this image on Facebook, and one friend from Pennsylvania commented that it shows God's love for all of us, to which several others agreed. What remains a mystery is why the farmer planted these rows of corn in the field in the rough shape of a cross. But even as an agnostic, I can feel and appreciate the spiritual significance to this interpretation, and regardless of what each person's religious beliefs might be, the idea that an aerial photograph that I made in the fall of 2011 of corn planted in the rough shape of a holy cross can be seen as a symbol of God's love for all of us is a deeply moving feeling. I gave this image to my friend Valerie as a birthday gift in tribute to her husband Bruce. As we move through the last throes of this truly remarkable winter, I find myself contemplating what is next, what is to come. But the Spirit will move me once again to venture out over the mine lands of Pennsylvania, along the mighty and beautiful Susquehanna River and the marshes of the eastern shore, gazing down at the land, contemplating and photographing the beauty and mystery that it holds when seen from above.